Norfolk Island sits alone in the South Pacific, a speck of green rising from the ocean roughly 1,500 kilometers off the eastern coast of Australia. To the tourists who visited each year from the mainland and from New Zealand, it looked like paradise, a place where time moved slowly, and the worst thing that could happen on any given day was a disagreement between neighbors over a property fence. To the people who called it home, it was exactly that. A community so small and so tight-knit that crime in any serious sense was not merely rare, it was practically a foreign concept. Nobody locked their doors, nobody checked over their shoulder, and for most of the island's approximately 2,000 residents, the idea that something truly terrible could happen among them had simply never taken root. That innocence would be shattered in the late spring of 2002, when a young woman who had moved there searching for a better life would disappear on an ordinary morning walk, only to be found hours later near a waterfall, her life taken in circumstances that would confound investigators and divide a community for more than 2 decades. Her name was Janelle Patton, and her story would become one of the most haunting and complicated cases ever to emerge from Australian soil. Janelle was born on June 30, 1972, in Sydney, Australia. She was an only child, and by all accounts her parents poured every ounce of their attention and love into raising her. From an early age, she showed a natural affinity for music. She learned to play the piano and the clarinet, and she became an active member of her school's music program, a detail that those who knew her always mentioned when describing the kind of young woman she was: curious, dedicated, and quietly passionate about the things she cared for. After finishing school, Janelle enrolled at university with ambitions of studying medicine, a path that spoke to both her intelligence and her desire to be useful in the world. But after roughly a year, she made the decision to step back from her studies. It was not a failure so much as a reorientation. She wanted to build something more immediate, something tangible. She found her footing in the banking sector and spent the next several years working steadily, constructing a professional life in one of Australia's largest and most relentless cities. For a time, that was enough. But cities have a way of wearing people down, and Sydney was no exception. The noise, the pace, the constant friction of urban life began to take a toll on Janelle in ways she could not easily ignore. She started thinking seriously about what she actually wanted her life to look like, and the answer she kept arriving at pointed away from the city and towards something quieter and more connected. In October 1999, at the age of 27, Janelle Patton made a decision that would change the entire course of her life. She moved to Norfolk Island. Officially a territory of Australia, the island operated during those years with a significant degree of local autonomy, maintaining its own laws, its own customs procedures, and a distinct identity shaped by its geography and its history. With a population of only around 2,000 people, Norfolk Island was the kind of place where everyone recognized each other at the petrol station and where a newcomer's arrival was genuinely noted by the community. New residents were rare. The island drew tourists in steady numbers, visitors from the Australian mainland, and from New Zealand who came to enjoy the natural beauty and the unhurried pace, but permanent settlers were another matter entirely. Janelle arrived as one of those rare outsiders choosing to stay, and over time she found her footing. She built friendships with the locals, settled into the rhythm of island life, and discovered in that remote and windswept place the sense of peace and belonging that Sydney had never quite offered her. The island felt like a village amplified, a community whose bonds were strengthened by the simple geographic fact that hundreds of kilometers of open ocean separated it from anywhere else. The people there had learned, over generations, to get along with one another. They had to. There was no walking away. By late 2002, Janelle had been living on Norfolk Island for roughly 3 years. She had a job, a small rented home, a circle of friends, and a daily routine that felt genuinely her own. When her parents made plans to come and visit, she was genuinely excited. They were a close family. The distance between Sydney and Norfolk Island had never diminished the bond between Janelle and the 2 people who had raised her, and this visit felt meaningful in a way that went beyond the simple pleasure of a reunion. They arrived on the island on May 30, 2002, flying in from the mainland, and Janelle spent that first day playing host with obvious enthusiasm, taking them around to see the key landmarks and introducing them to the people and places that had come to define her life on the island. Because Janelle's accommodation was sized only for one person, her parents were booked into a hotel for the duration of their stay. That evening, the family no doubt shared a meal and caught up on months of ordinary life, the kind of conversation that only happens comfortably between people who genuinely know and trust each other. Nobody could have known that the following morning would be the last time Janelle's parents would see their daughter alive. The next day began without any particular sign of what was coming. Janelle finished her work shift at approximately 11 o'clock in the morning and set off on her daily walk, a routine she had kept up with remarkable consistency since settling on the island. The route was familiar to everyone who knew her, a path that wound from her home to a scenic lookout perched at the island's edge, where the land dropped away and the Pacific stretched out to the horizon in every direction. It was the kind of walk that cleared the mind, the sort of ritual that people who live on islands often develop as a way of reminding themselves of where they are and how fortunate they are to be there. Her parents had arranged to meet her at their hotel around noon. When that hour passed with no sign of Janelle and no word from her, they were not immediately alarmed. Anyone can get delayed. Life on a small island tends to produce unexpected conversations and impromptu detours. They assumed she had been held up by some minor errand or a friendly encounter and decided not to wait passively. Before leaving the hotel for a short walk of their own, they slid a handwritten note into the door of their room, letting Janelle know they had stepped out and would be back shortly. When they returned at 2:30 in the afternoon, the note was still exactly where they had left it. Nobody had been there. Janelle had not come. The quiet unease that had been sitting at the edge of their awareness began to harden into something sharper. They tried calling her. She did not answer. They tried again. Still nothing. For parents visiting their daughter on a remote island with no easy means of escape or outside help, the silence on the other end of the line was profoundly unsettling. They made their way to Janelle's home. The front door was unlocked, which would have been unremarkable to any long-time resident of Norfolk Island, where the culture of leaving doors open was simply a reflection of how safe the community had always felt. But inside there was no sign of Janelle, nothing to suggest anything had gone wrong, and nothing to indicate where she might be. Her car was parked right where it should have been, outside the house, untouched. While her parents stood in that quiet space trying to make sense of what they were seeing, one of Janelle's friends happened to arrive. The parents explained the situation, the entire day of silence and missed meetings, and the friend immediately offered to help. The three of them climbed into a vehicle and drove the length of Janelle's usual walking route from beginning to end. They looked carefully. They found nothing, not a trace. Back at the hotel, the manager was brought into the loop and began working the phones, calling around to various people across the island asking whether anyone had seen Janelle that day. None of the calls produced an answer. By the time the parents sat down to truly reckon with what was happening, it was approaching 8 o'clock in the evening. Nearly 9 hours had passed since Janelle had last been seen. They picked up the phone and called the police. At the station, what they heard stopped them cold. The officers explained that approximately 1 hour before the parents' call had come in, a tourist visiting from New Zealand had been walking near a waterfall on the island when she noticed something that did not belong. A large black plastic sheet, crumpled on the ground near the base of the falls, with what appeared to be human hands visible beneath it. She had approached, she had looked closer, and she had called for help immediately. When officers arrived at the scene, they found the body of a woman. She had sustained numerous visible injuries. Her clothing was only partially present. She had been left there, concealed beneath that sheet of dark plastic, alone in the wet undergrowth. To spare the parents from the immediate trauma of a formal identification, officers reached out to the woman who owned the property where Janelle rented her small home. The landlord came to the scene. She took one look and confirmed what the investigators had already begun to suspect. It was Janelle Patton. Janelle was 30 years old. Her parents, who had flown to this island to spend time with their daughter, were now sitting in a police station learning that she was gone. The news rippled through Norfolk Island with the weight of something almost incomprehensible. The last recorded killing on the island had occurred in 1893, more than a century earlier. Serious crime of any kind was such a distant concept to the local population that the island's small police contingent had spent most of their careers handling disputes, minor incidents, and the occasional drunken altercation. Now they were facing a homicide investigation, and they knew almost immediately that the resources and expertise available locally were not equal to what this case would require. A formal request went out to Australian federal investigators, who made the flight across to Norfolk Island and took on a leading role in the inquiry. The combined team got to work. What they would discover over the coming days and weeks painted a grim and complex picture, one that raised far more questions than it answered. The medical examination of Janelle's body was thorough and sobering. Experts identified 64 separate injuries, a number that spoke to the extreme violence she had been subjected to. Among those injuries were abrasions and lacerations consistent with contact from a sharp object, specifically broken glass, most likely from a bottle. Supporting this finding, forensic technicians recovered tiny fragments of glass from Janelle's hair, particles that, in the investigators' assessment, had almost certainly come from a bottle that had been deliberately smashed. Beyond the glass injuries, the pattern of bruising on Janelle's wrists told its own story. The bruising was consistent with someone holding her firmly by the arms, restraining her, investigators believed, while the injuries were being inflicted. That detail, more than almost any other, led the forensic team to consider the possibility that more than one person had been involved in the attack. There were also wounds consistent with a bladed instrument, suggesting that at some point during the assault, a knife had been used as well. Taken together, the injuries painted a picture of an extended and violent encounter, not a brief struggle, but something prolonged and deliberate. Forensic teams also recovered microscopic particles of green and white paint from Janelle's body, her clothing, and her hair. The expert interpretation was that these particles had likely transferred from a vehicle, perhaps during the process of moving or transporting her body, when contact between her and the vehicle's surfaces would have been unavoidable. This detail would become one of the most important forensic threads in the entire investigation. Crucially, despite the partial state of her clothing, which investigators noted as a factor requiring consideration, the medical examination found no direct evidence of a sexual assault. What was found, however, was something equally significant, a DNA profile from an unknown individual. More specifically, it was the genetic material of an unknown woman, identified from samples recovered from the body. That detail would haunt the investigation and eventually become a focal point of the courtroom battle that lay years ahead. The investigation faced a severe early setback in the form of weather. Rain had fallen across the area before the body was discovered, washing away what might otherwise have been crucial physical evidence. Shoe prints, biological material, trace evidence that could have pointed directly to a suspect. All of it had been degraded or destroyed by the downpour. But investigators did extract one useful piece of information from the rain itself. The puddles of standing water that had collected on top of the black plastic sheeting indicated, with a reasonable degree of certainty, that Janelle's body had been placed there before the rain began. Working backward from the weather records and the timeline, investigators concluded that she had been lying at that location for at least 3 hours before the New Zealand tourist discovered her. That placed the attack firmly in the late morning hours. Building a precise timeline became one of the investigation's central tasks. Officers painstakingly interviewed residents and retraced every confirmed sighting of Janelle during the last hours of her life. After finishing her morning shift, she had stopped briefly at a local shop before making her way home. The woman who owned the property where she rented her home confirmed that she had seen Janelle leaving the house and heading out on her walk. Approximately 10 minutes after that, another resident driving along the road reported passing Janelle on foot. The next confirmed sighting was more telling. A woman who lived near the far end of Janelle's regular walking route reported seeing her standing beside a white car, apparently engaged in a conversation with the driver or drivers. The witness was not certain whether there was one man in the vehicle or two, but she clearly recalled that Janelle appeared to be talking to whoever was inside. Roughly 5 minutes after that sighting, two separate witnesses living in the same general area reported hearing a sound that they initially thought was a child crying somewhere in the distance. A third resident, not far from them, heard what he described as a scream. He went outside to check what was happening. By the time he was on his feet and looking around, the sound had already gone quiet. Based on these overlapping accounts, investigators were able to establish that the attack on Janelle most likely occurred at approximately 11:45 in the morning, no more than half an hour after she had finished work. Whatever happened near that white car, whatever conversation had drawn her close to it, had ended in violence. The investigation that followed was one of the most extensive ever conducted on Norfolk Island. Officers went door to door across the entire resident population, eventually speaking with more than 400 people in the effort to identify anyone who might have witnessed something relevant or held a piece of the puzzle. It was painstaking work on a small island where everyone knew everyone, where people were cooperative, but where the memory of what had happened was still raw. The island had no network of surveillance cameras, no infrastructure for the kind of passive observation that helps investigators in larger cities reconstruct events. Everything had to come from physical evidence, forensic analysis, and the recollections of people who had gone about their day without realizing they were witnesses to the prelude of a tragedy. Forensic analysts turned their attention to the paint particles. Working carefully with the samples recovered from Janelle's body and clothing, they determined that the green particles were consistent with automotive paint, specifically the kind used as a body coat, while the white particles beneath them were consistent with an undercoat or primer layer. This pointed investigators toward the conclusion that the vehicle in question had green bodywork over a white undercoat, a fairly specific combination that, on a small island with a limited number of registered vehicles, should theoretically have been traceable. Officers systematically reviewed every white registered vehicle on Norfolk Island and worked outward from there. DNA samples were collected from a significant number of residents in an attempt to find a match to the unknown female profile recovered from the body. Tests were run through Australian federal databases. No match was found. The investigation had run out of road domestically. Quietly, without public announcement, the DNA profile was forwarded to law enforcement agencies in other countries, expanding the search beyond Australian borders in the hope that a match might exist somewhere in an international database. The answer, when it finally came, arrived in 2005, roughly 3 years after the killing. The DNA profile matched a record held in a foreign database, and the name attached to that profile was Glenn McNeil, a citizen of New Zealand. According to investigative records, McNeil had been living on Norfolk Island at the time of the murder. He had left the island in the period shortly after Janelle's death and had returned to New Zealand, where he had been living ever since. His departure from the island had not initially been considered suspicious, as people came and went from Norfolk Island with regularity, particularly those on temporary work arrangements or extended stays. But the DNA match changed everything. Investigators now had a biological thread connecting McNeil directly to the crime scene and to the victim. The case, which had spent years in an investigative holding pattern, suddenly had a clear direction. The white vehicle that McNeil had been associated with during his time on the island, a Honda, had never made it back to him after his departure. It had been located on a private property, abandoned in dense undergrowth, apparently left there and forgotten. The vehicle was recovered and transferred to forensic specialists. A search warrant was also obtained for the residence on Norfolk Island, where McNeil had been living at the time of the murder. What investigators found across both the car and the property was significant. The interior of the vehicle, examined with forensic precision down to the last surface, yielded particles of green automotive paint. When these were compared to the paint particles recovered from Janelle's body, clothing, and hair, the match was confirmed. Glass fragments were recovered from the vehicle and from the former residence as well. A forensic expert then conducted a more detailed analysis, concluding that the glass fragments found in the car, the fragments found at the property, and the fragments recovered from the victim's body and clothing had not merely similar characteristics. They had been produced as part of the same manufacturing run. In other words, they had come from the same single object. One of the fragments carried a partial engraving, and when magnified and interpreted, that engraving was identified as part of a wine label. The conclusion, reached with considerable confidence by the expert, was that all 3 sets of glass evidence had originated from the same wine bottle, a bottle that had been broken and used as a weapon during the attack on Janelle Patton. In the yard surrounding McNeil's former residence, officers found further physical evidence. A roll of black plastic sheeting, identical in type and composition to the sheeting in which Janelle's body had been wrapped when the tourists discovered it near the waterfall. Alongside it, investigators recovered several human hairs and what appeared to be biological trace material. However, time and weather had not been kind to these samples. By the period of their discovery, the biological traces had deteriorated to the point where extracting a usable DNA profile from them was not possible with the equipment available in Australia. Determined not to let this potential evidence simply expire, investigators made the decision to send the hair samples to a laboratory in the United States, where analysts possessed more advanced tools for examining degraded biological material. The process was not quick. The first laboratory they engaged was running at full capacity and could not begin the analysis within an acceptable timeframe. One of the lead investigators eventually traveled to the United States in person to hand-deliver the samples to a second facility better equipped to handle the work. The results finally arrived in early 2006. After nearly a year of waiting, the laboratory confirmed that the hairs recovered from the yard of Glenn McNeil's former home on Norfolk Island belonged to Janelle Patton. With that confirmation in hand, the investigators compiled their evidence and obtained an arrest warrant. Officers traveled to New Zealand, located McNeil, and took him into custody. He was subsequently deported to Australia and formally charged with the killing of Janelle Patton. What happened in the first round of interrogation came as something of a surprise. Rather than offering silence or outright denial, McNeil began to speak. He offered an account of what he said had happened on the morning of May 31, 2002. According to his version, he had spent that morning smoking marijuana and driving aimlessly around the island. At some point while behind the wheel, he had leaned down to retrieve a pack of cigarettes that had slipped to the floor of the car. In doing so, he said, he lost sight of the road ahead of him and struck something. His initial assumption was that he had hit an animal. When he stopped the car and stepped out to check, he found a human body beneath the vehicle. He panicked. Without calling for help and without making any attempt to get medical assistance for the person he had struck, he placed the body in the boot of his car and drove home. There, over the course of several hours, he consumed various substances. At some point, he claimed, he heard sounds coming from the boot. He realized to his horror that the woman was still alive. His response, according to his statement, was to retrieve a kitchen knife from inside the house, return to the car, open the boot, and fatally wound her. He then wrapped the body in plastic sheeting and drove to the area near the waterfall, where he left her concealed beneath the sheeting and walked away. Investigators listened to this account carefully, and they concluded almost immediately that it could not be accurate. The medical experts who had examined Janelle's body had been thorough and deliberate in their analysis of her injuries, and their professional opinion was clear. The injuries Janelle sustained were not consistent, in pattern or in character, with someone having been struck by a motor vehicle. Beyond that fundamental inconsistency, McNeil's account failed to explain several other critical details. It did not account for the bruising on her wrists, which spoke to physical restraint. It did not explain the injuries consistent with glass fragments, which suggested a deliberate and close contact assault rather than an accident. It did not explain why portions of her clothing had been removed. And perhaps most damningly, if McNeil had truly attacked Janelle with a kitchen knife while she lay in the boot of his car, the interior of that boot would have contained unmistakable traces of biological evidence. Forensic experts had examined the vehicle thoroughly. No such traces were found. Every significant element of McNeil's story, when held up against the physical evidence, failed to hold together. Despite the pressure applied by detectives, who laid out these contradictions directly and methodically, McNeil refused to revise his account. He insisted that what he had described was the truth. The decision was made to take the matter to trial. The court proceedings began in the summer of 2006 and were held on Norfolk Island itself. Given the island's small population, the jury was composed of local residents, a circumstance that made the already intimate nature of the case feel even more charged. These were people who had known Janelle, who had walked the same road she walked, who had felt the shockwave of her death pass through their community 3 years earlier. Glenn McNeil, seated in the defendant's dock, wasted no time in reversing course entirely. He declared that he had had absolutely nothing to do with the killing, and remarkably, that he had no memory whatsoever of having given police the confession they were now prepared to present in court. He attributed this claimed amnesia to what he described as serious and ongoing mental health difficulties. No medical documentation was produced to support this characterization. As the trial began, the prosecution team was aware that they would need to prepare for a defense challenge centered on the unidentified female DNA recovered from Janelle's body. That profile had been found not only on the surface of her clothing, but crucially under her fingernails, a detail suggesting that Janelle may have clawed or scratched at this other individual during the struggle that ended her life. The implication, which defense attorneys would inevitably raise, was that the presence of female DNA under the victim's fingernails pointed to a female perpetrator or co-perpetrator, and that this person remained unidentified and uncharged. In building their case, investigators had gone back through Janelle's social circle with fresh and targeted questions. One of her friends recalled a conversation that had occurred 2 to 3 weeks before the killing. On that occasion, Janelle had approached her and asked, somewhat unexpectedly, whether she knew a woman named Alicia and her husband, a man named Glenn McNeil. The friend said she had seen the couple in passing but had no meaningful relationship with them. Janelle had not elaborated on why she was asking. She had simply changed the subject. That same friend, it turned out, had been working at a hotel on the morning of May 31. During that shift, she had looked out and seen a woman she recognized as Alicia on the street outside. What she noticed was that Alicia's clothing appeared to be covered in something red. The witness had asked, out of simple concern, whether everything was all right. Alicia had replied that it was nothing, only paint, and she had walked away. In the immediate aftermath, the witness had not connected what she saw to the disappearance of Janelle Patton. There had been no reason to, not yet. It was only when investigators, months and then years later, began asking detailed questions about McNeil and the people around him that she brought the memory forward and understood its potential significance. When Alicia was called to give evidence at trial, she denied any involvement in Janelle's death. But the testimony of her witness acquaintance, the woman who had seen her that day, apparently covered in something red, sat uncomfortably alongside that denial. Then came a development that complicated matters considerably. The same friend who had offered that critical account of what she witnessed on the morning of the murder later changed her testimony in a substantial way. She returned to the proceedings with an entirely new version of events, claiming that Janelle's killing had not been carried out by Glenn McNeil or Alicia, but rather by a religious group of 6 individuals. This dramatic revision, offered without any supporting detail or verifiable evidence, effectively cast a shadow of doubt over everything she had previously said. Defense attorneys could now point to her as a witness whose reliability was seriously compromised. For investigators, it was a painful and frustrating development. The testimony they had believed to be one of their more solid pieces of supporting evidence had become something far more ambiguous. Glenn McNeil, throughout the trial, maintained that he had no memory of giving any confession and no involvement in what had happened to Janelle. He offered no alternative account that could be independently verified. The jury, after deliberating on the body of evidence presented to them, reached a verdict of guilty. On March 9, 2007, Glenn McNeil was sentenced to 24 years in prison for the killing of Janelle Patton. For her parents, who had traveled to this remote island expecting to spend a week with their daughter and had instead watched her life be taken and spent the following years seeking accountability, the verdict was a moment of grim and partial closure. The word partial is important because from almost the moment the verdict was delivered, questions continued to circulate, quietly at first and then with increasing volume, about the full truth of what had happened on that morning walk. The most persistent of those questions centered on whether Glenn McNeil had acted entirely alone. The physical evidence, specifically the wrist bruising suggesting restraint,